Okay, good evening, everyone. Oh, hey, Chris. How's it going? Hey, everyone. My name is Paige Newman. I'm a curator here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this noontime lecture and our regular scholar series. We wish to acknowledge the generous support of Conrad Mercer Hall, who has endowed the VMHC Scholar Series. Conrad serves as an honorary vice chair of the Board of Trustees of this institution and has been a champion of our work for decades. We also wish to acknowledge former VMHC President and CEO, Dr. Charles Bryan, whom this series also honors. So, some upcoming events before we get to the main event today. Join us at the end of the month for a celebration of Virginia Wine Month. On October 26th, join us for Virginia Vines, featuring selections from some of the Commonwealth's best wineries and vineyards, as well as live jazz, food trucks, and after-hours access to our latest exhibition, Traveling Bricks. The next lecture in our Scholar Series will take place here in the Robbins Forum on November 14th, 2024 at noon. Lenwyn Norman, the former Director of Communications during Doug Wilder's tenure as Mayor of Richmond, will be here to give an insider's view into the strong mayor, an approach that characterized Wilder's tenure in the 2000s. So for today's program, let's start turning off our mobile phones, or anything that buzzes or beeps. So let's get to the main event. I'm happy to introduce my good friend, Greg Hansard. But let's start with that cider has been one of Virginia's favorite beverages for more than 400 years, representing a time-honored ingredient of cultural heritage brought to the Americas by the first English settlers. Since the 17th century, apple orchards have been a fixture of Virginia's agricultural landscape, and cider has been consumed by almost everyone, men, women, and even children, of all classes and stations throughout the state's history. From the craft's early days in colonial times to the renaissance of cider culture and cultivation in recent decades, today's lecture will reveal the staple beverage's surprisingly deep roots. And returning to the VMHC today is Greg Hansard. Greg is an educator in history and museum studies at Bright Point Community College. He previously worked at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture as both manager of web and digital resources and as assistant editor of publications. In 2018, Greg's first book, German Sailors in Hampton Roads, a World War I story at the Norfolk Navy Yard, was published by the History Press. His most recent book, titled Virginia Cider, A Guide from Colonial Days to Craft's Golden Age, was released just yesterday. Congrats, Greg. And forms the basis of this noontime talk. So please join me in giving a big congratulations and a warm welcome to Greg Hansard.
Thank you, Paige, for that warm introduction. It's really an honor to have one of my fellow BMHC colleagues and alcohol history enthusiasts introduce me. So thank you, Paige. It's wonderful to be back at the place where I spent more than 10 years of my career, and I'm very excited to see so many familiar faces, whether they're former colleagues, current colleagues, friends, and family. So I really appreciate the support. Thank you. I was fortunate to give my first banner lecture here in 2018, or when it was the banner lecture. We've updated the name, but it was a great opportunity to talk about my book, German Sailors in Hampton Roads. And I'm happy once again to be a part of this lecture series named in honor of Charles F. Bryan. Dr. Bryan was president and CEO when I started at the VHS back in 2005. And he's supported me throughout my academic and professional pursuits. So I'm very thankful to him. I'd also like to thank my good friend, Graham Dozier, who organized this lecture. We used to work together in the publications department. And I was a little worried he was going to have me index or fact check an article of the VMHB, but fortunately that was not the case. So thank you, Graham, for not doing that. Both of my books would not have been possible with my editor and dear friend, Nelson Langford. Many of you may know Nelson. He was my former boss at the VHS, and he has provided thoughtful and also productive comments on both of my manuscripts, which helped for publication. So thank you, Nelson, as well. People sometimes ask me how I find my topics, because they're pretty diverse. They're related to Virginia history. But I always tell them it's easy to find topics when you work in a museum. You're constantly immersed in and surrounded by interesting and magnificent artifacts that are begging you to tell their story. I found my first topic when I was coming through the archives and came across a postcard. It's a photograph of some jovial German sailors on board a ship in Hampton Roads. And that eventually led to a story of a Virginia maritime community during the Great War. For my current subject on Virginia cider, it wasn't necessarily an object in the collections that sparked my interest, but a museum event that allowed me to taste history. And pages here, so you can, there's evidence, right? One of the museum programs that I was fortunate to be a part of was called History on Tap. Museum staff would locate unique recipes from the archives and then partner with a local brewery, meadery, or cidery to recreate it. My favorite collaboration involved a historic cider recipe from Eliza Smith's The Complete Housewife, which was the first cookbook published in the 13 colonies when it was published in 1742 in Williamsburg. The recipe followed a fairly typical cider production routine. Albemarle pippins were fermented in an oak barrel, but in addition to apples, it called for raisins, possibly for nutrients or a fermentation accelerant. And Courtney Maley, who's pictured here on the left, or on your right, and her staff at Blue Bee Cider recreated this recipe and then hosted a tasting of the surprisingly flavorful, complex beverage, which was aptly named the Complete Cider after the cookbook. The event also included a discussion at the Richmond Cidery where Dr. Sarah Meacham, author of Every Home a Distillery, Alcohol, Gender, and Technology in the Colonial Chesapeake, talked about how cider was colonial America's beverage of choice. And she also noted that the main producers of alcohol were women and enslaved workers. And it's this program, History on Tap, that really inspired me to pursue a book project on Virginia's rich cider history. Now, before we begin on this journey of cider in Virginia, we need to have some clarification on what exactly cider is. Cider in its simplest form is the fermented juice of apples. As a kid, I always thought that cider was that dark, murky, non-alcoholic beverage, but still tasty, that beverage that my mom brought home from the grocery store around Halloween. Many of you probably have that same idea, right? But pretty much everywhere else in the world, cider is the fermented juice of apples. We've started to label, or America has started to label cider as hard cider. Much of that has to do with the temperance movement and prohibition. But throughout the rest of the world, if you order a cider, it's the alcoholic version. Today, I will be referring to the alcoholic version as simply cider, which we can see simply cider here, the alcoholic version. Now, cider has a long history of providing much needed nutrients to humans. And by the 1500s, it was a staple beverage in England. As the quality and interest in cider increased, it competed with English ale as the nation's top drink. And when explorers ventured to North America, they brought with them alcohol and knowledge of cider and orchard management. And the Old Dominion would play a major role in the story of cider in America. Crops like apples were eventually grown at Jamestown, but it would take time to establish orchards. you may not be aware, but Malus domestica, the domestic apple, is not native to the Americas. There were some crab apples present, but not the domestic apple. So grafts or cuttings had to be sent to Virginia. Also, honeybees are not native to the Americas, so they had to be imported as well. Honeybees are obviously essential for pollination, fruit tree pollination. Despite this, little town plantation owner George Menifee began an orchard as early as 1623 on his 1,200-acre Williamsburg farm. And by 1629, numerous apple trees were bearing fruit throughout the Tidewater region. The Crown also became very vested in apple growth throughout Virginia for economic purposes. In 1639, the Colonial General Assembly ordered anyone who obtained a patent of 100 acres to establish an orchard. 3 years later, in 1642, King Charles I gave orders that all colonists in Virginia fence in every 500 acres of orchards or gardens. Obviously, this would ensure that the fruit trees were protected against animals. By the turn of the century, Virginia apples became well known not only in America, but also throughout Europe. This is in 1701, there's an account from a man named Francis Michel of Bern, Switzerland, and he claimed that the apple trees in Virginia are exceedingly fruitful. I was at many places where I could not estimate the large quantities where they were rotting on the ground. They are the nicest apples I have ever seen. For the Chesapeake settlers, cider provided a good alternative to the potentially unstable water of the Tidewater region. Alcohol consumption was also part of European customs, and English settlers carried on that tradition in the Commonwealth. They drank for nearly every occasion. There are accounts at weddings, court days, births and deaths, elections, church services, of course, and militia musters. That was a really big thing. And even at every meal, they had cider. There are accounts of that. And for children, there was even ciderkin that was produced, which is repressing the juice to create a lower fermented cider alcohol, similar to like how small beer would be made by repressing the grains. Now, another social custom that was carried over from England to Virginia was that women were the main producers of cider and small homesteads. And women's ability to produce cider kept these families going by providing the much needed nutrients. Recipes and cookbooks were passed down to the females in the family to ensure that the knowledge would continue to thrive. By the mid-17th century, almost every plantation in the Chesapeake possessed orchards, and orchard maintenance and cider production on large estates was performed by enslaved people. As early as 1642, prominent landowner and colonial administrator Sir William Berkeley had a thriving orchard of more than 1,500 trees at his Green Spring plantation near Jamestown, where he made cider. In 1676, writer Thomas Glover noted that some Virginia planters have 1,200 trees and upward bearing all sorts of English apples, of which they make a great store of cider. And by the turn of the century, politician and plantation owner William Fitzhugh had one of the largest orchards in the English colonies in Westmoreland County that included at least 2,500 apple trees. And there are accounts that his orchard could produce upwards of 10,000 gallons of cider a year. George Washington had an orchard at Mount Vernon, which he dedicated to cider production. He also relied on skilled enslaved laborers to manage the fruit trees and produce the alcohol on his estate. Many of the Virginia planters, and I came across several accounts of this in my research, they corresponded regularly on which apples grew best in the conditions and also which apples made the tastiest cider. William Diggs and George Mason both sold twigs or zions to Washington of the productive trees that they had. So they sold those to Washington. Washington's apple interest led him to visit the well-known William Prince Nursery in Flushing, New York in 1789. Robert Prince had established the first commercial apple tree nursery in America in 1737. The nursery was very popular by the late 18th century, but Washington seemed a little less than impressed with the business when he visited on October 10th. This is a quote from Washington's letter. I set off from New York about 9 o'clock in my barge to visit Mr. Prince's fruit gardens and shrubberies at Flushing. These gardens, except in the number of young fruit trees, did not answer my expectations. The shrubs were trifling and the flowers not numerous. So Washington was a bit critical of Prince's nursery. Martha Washington had inherited a cookbook from her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, that included a cider recipe. The book had belonged to Daniel's mother, Martha's mother-in-law, Miss Frances Parke Custis, as it was common for cookbooks to be handed down to the females of the family. The recipe is also pretty typical. Apples were beaten, squeezed, and left to stand for at least 4 days. The juice was then put into a clean vessel, which it was left open to ferment. One thing that is a bit unique about this cider recipe is that a small bag of spices were hung in the vessel. You do see today several cideries that will add, spices to their ciders. So it's interesting to use those historic recipes. The cask was then closed up with a stopper, and after 6 months, it would be put into bottles and ready to drink. Martha eventually gave the cookbook to her daughter, Nellie Eleanor Parke Custis. Thomas Jefferson was one of the biggest fans of the fermented apple and regularly compared Virginia cider to fine European wine. At Monticello, he had more than 1,000 fruit trees and grew 18 different apple varieties in his orchards. He concentrated on 4 main types for cider production: Hughes crab, which we'll talk about in a little bit, Tolliver, which is now extinct, but was really his favorite one, Newtown Pippin, which is also known as Albemarle Pippin. We'll also talk about that in a little bit, and also Spitzenberg, which hailed from New York. Jefferson documented his planting methods in his farm book, which included an entire section dedicated to his orchards, where he recorded how he cultivated apple trees and processed cider. He even included a detailed drawing of an apple mill and press. Jefferson documented his enslaved laborers' duties, which included cider production. He purchased George Granger Sr. and his wife Ursula, as well as their son George Jr., from a Cumberland County plantation owner in the early 1770s. And the Granger family would go on to serve in key positions at Monticello for the next several decades. The Grangers not only made cider, but also took care of the orchards at Monticello. George was tasked with maintaining the orchards while Jefferson was away in Paris and continued his duties upon Jefferson's return to Virginia. Jupiter Evans was another one of Jefferson's enslaved cider makers. Evans was born at Shadwell the same year as Jefferson and served as his personal attendant for 10 years. His value to Monticello's cider operation is evident in a letter Jefferson wrote to his son-in-law, Thomas Mann Randolph, in 1800. In the letter, Jefferson is lamenting Jupiter's death, and he says, "He leaves a void in my administration which I cannot fill up." Managing the orchards and making cider at Monticello could be a very tedious operation. Edmund Bacon, a white overseer at Monticello, said that every March he and several house servants and enslaved laborers, that included Betty Brown, Sally, Critta, Betty Hemmons, Nance, and also Ursula Granger Hughes, which was the granddaughter of George and Ursula. They bottled all the cider. Bacon recalled the exhausting bottling operation. "Dear me, this was a job," he said, or he wrote, "It took us 2 weeks. Mr. Jefferson was very particular about his cider. He gave me instructions to have every apple cleaned perfectly when it was made." Jefferson would also give instructions on when to pick the apples, how to clean them, how to sort them, and he said that only the best could be used to make what he referred to as fine cider. Large amounts of apple growing and cider making in the Commonwealth continued in small farms and homesteads through the mid-19th century. But after the Civil War, many orchards were abandoned with the migration of rural families into the cities. The Second Industrial Revolution, as well as immigration, paved the way for mass-produced beverages such as lagers. And many Americans' palates shifted from the bold flavors of handcrafted farmhouse ciders towards the clean, crisp, mass-produced lagers. Not that there's anything wrong with lagers. We have a beer historian with us today, but it's just, again, with immigration and also that mass-produced piece takes place. The temperance movement and prohibition have often been cited as the main reason for cider's demise in America, but cider consumption and production were already on the decline by that point. And it wouldn't be until after the wine and craft beer revolution of the late 20th century that cider would see a reemergence as a popular American beverage. By the turn of the century, cideries started to appear in specific apple growing regions, and today there are nearly 1,000 cider producers in the US. New York and California lead the way with over 100, but Virginia is in the top 7 with more than 50. Within the span of a few decades, the Virginia cider business has grown from a handful of rural cideries to a robust industry featuring urban cideries and an array of all kinds of different business models. One of the trailblazers responsible for the growth in not only Virginia, but also the South in apples and cider is Diane Flint. Some of you were probably fortunate to attend her lecture at the VMHC in June on her new book, Wild, Tamed, Lost, Revived, The Surprising Story of Apples in the South, which you can purchase in the bookstore here. It's a must-have for any apple or cider enthusiast, and it has beautiful illustrations throughout the book. She opened Foggy Ridge Cider in Dougspur in 1997, and it became the first licensed cidery in the South solely dedicated to making cider. She sold her first bottle of Foggy Ridge cider in 2004 and quickly began distributing to more than 25 states. So the product was definitely reaching throughout the US. Her ciders have received numerous honors, and she has been nominated for several food and beverage awards as well. In 2018, she retired the cidery after 20 years of operation, but has continued to maintain her orchard. Her focus is now on helping cider makers get the best ingredients for their product. And her orchard at Foggy Ridge is still one of the best around in terms of specific cider apple varieties. As we begin to look at some of the cider producers in the Old Dominion, it's important to understand that all apples can make cider, but all apples do not necessarily make good cider. Some of those pretty grocery store apples that we love, right? Like Honeycrisp, Red Delicious, Fuji. I like Fuji. That's one of my favorites for just a grocery store apple. They don't work well for cider. For a good cider, you need apples that have a good sugar content, that have enough acidity and tannins. And this fruit might not be the prettiest, and it might not necessarily taste the best. Chuck Shelton, who we'll look at in a minute at Albemarle, I was at Albemarle Cider Works, and he gave me a Dabinette, which is a great cider apple, but it's known as a spitter And he said, here, try this. I'd never tried one. Just take a bite and you spit it out. It's very difficult, right, to eat as a fresh apple, but it makes a fantastic cider. And so cider makers will use blends many times, right, of trying to get different elements from each apple to create their product. But there are some single varietals that will work as well, like a Hughes Crab or a Harrison or even an Albemarle Pippin. They have enough of these elements, enough tannins, enough acidity and sugar content to create just a single varietal on its own. Many cider apples are also heirloom or heritage, meaning their history can be traced back at least 75 years. Two of the best examples of historic or heirloom apples that have Virginia connections and are coveted by cider makers are Hughes Crab and Albemarle Pippin. And we'll look at both of those right now. Hughes Crab is a small, light red apple with green specks and a translucent yellow flesh. It also has a strong, musky flavor, but it's one of the most prized cider apples in the South and arguably the most notable American cider apple. Its origins are unknown, but it's likely a cross between the domestic apple from Europe, Malus domestica, and also a native crab apple. Even though it is unclear on the exact beginnings, Hughes was mentioned in newspaper advertisements in Williamsburg as early as the mid-18th century. Apple hunter and historian Lee Calhoun called Hughes the most celebrated apple ever grown in the South, making a dry, unsurpassed in flavor and keeping ability, a dry cider, unsurpassed in flavor and keeping ability. John Hartwell Cock, friend of Jefferson and founder of the University of Virginia, said that Hughes is the best cider I have ever seen. The apple was so widespread that northern newspapers regularly advertised it for sale by the 18th century, by the late 18th century. This is from the Pennsylvania Gazette, and you can see at the bottom an advertisement for Hughes Crab imported from Virginia. It was imported to other states or to other colonies. The apple makes a great cider with tropical flavors and possible cinnamon, banana, and pear notes. As a single varietal, it's full-bodied and comparable to some complex white wines with adequate tannins and acidity. The Newtown Pippin was the first commercially successful apple in North America. Discovered in New York along Newtown Creek in 1730, by the mid-18th century, the Newtown Pippin had spread throughout the colonies. During the Revolutionary War, Dr. Thomas Walker brought scions of the apple tree from the Northeast and planted them at his estate at Castle Hill in Charlottesville, now Keswick. Jefferson also acquired cuttings and started growing them at Monticello. The Virginia climate transformed this cultivar to take on tropical flavors, most notably lime. So this Newtown Pippin and Albemarle Pippin, the names are used interchangeably, but when it's grown in Virginia in the South, it takes on different flavors and will be referred to as Albemarle Pippin. When comparing the Newtown and Albemarle Pippin to European apples while in France, Jefferson claimed they, the French, have no apples here to compare with our Newtown Pippin. It's quite a bold claim from Jefferson while he's in France, talking about their food, right? The English agriculturalist Richard Parkinson in 1799 said that the Newtown Pippin was the world's best apple. Apple historian Tom Burford claimed that cider made from the fruit is very clear and considered to be of the finest quality. He even referred to it as his Sunday cider. This apple makes a wonderful single varietal that exhibits notes and aromas of green apples, grapes, citrus, and also a very rich flavor for the single varietal versions. With more than 50 cider producers in the state, each cidery has their own unique story. From urban businesses like Buskey Cider in the capital of the Commonwealth to rural producers like Tumbling Creek tucked away in Abingdon. They all produce their own style. Some use adjuncts, spices, and fruits that have been popular with other beverage industries, and others focus solely on historic apples, recipes, and methods. It's very difficult to select only a handful of cideries to discuss today because they're really all wonderful in their own way. I've tried to highlight a few that showcase the diversity and excellence of Virginia cider, but you will have to read the book to explore them all. If you've ever been to Monterey in Highland County, then you know the Big Fish building located on Spruce Street. It's actually just down the hill from my Uncle John and Aunt Susie, who are here today. The iconic structure once housed the Maple, a restaurant known to have the best trout around. But now the Big Fish on top represents some of the best cider around. Kirk Billingsley, who was born and raised in Monterey, purchased the building in 2015 for his new cidery, but there was one problem. Kirk didn't have a name. And so after debating on several names, he simply thought what he called the place that he was in, the Big Fish. And the name finally stuck, and he decided that Big Fish Cider Company would be Highland County's new cidery. I think Kirk's operation is one of the more unique because of the apples he uses. Due to its elevation, Highland County has very different temperature zones for apple growing than other parts of the state. They may not be able to grow as many apples as other areas due to late frost, but the apples have a unique flavor and an acidity that makes elegant ciders. Some of his favorite apples to work with are wild apples in the community. They're perfect for cider because they grow in areas where the trees have been left alone without any human interaction. The unidentified trees, many of them over 50 years old, are free from chemicals that affect their growth and flavor. Kirk forages for wild apples on his own, and he also asks the community to provide apples from their homesteads. This belief is evident in his Highland Scrumpy, a cider made from apples donated during a community apple drive. Kirk presses more than 20 different varieties of apples and uses 2 different wine yeasts for fermentation, and the result is an intricate golden cider with floral and pear aromas. The wonderful balance creates a clean yet creamy mouthfeel with earthy flavors and some lingering melon notes. His lineup consists of other forage creations, traditional single varietals, and unique offerings like a maple-infused cider. That is obviously a tribute to what Monterey is really known for, the Monterey Maple Festival. Potter's Craft Cider began when 2 Princeton college buddies, Tim Edmond and Dan Potter, who had a shared love of home brewing, transitioned their passion from beer to fermenting apples. They opened Potter's in 2011 in Free Union, and it was one of the first cideries in Virginia. And in 2013, they recruited Andy Hannes to be their cider maker. He's a chef by trade, and he incorporated that background when working with different ingredients, and he produces truly unique and flavorful ciders. He is highly revered in the cider industry for his creativity and willing to work outside of the limits. His style also includes single varietals to barrel-aged blends with spices. In 2019, Potter's acquired Nev Hall. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is located just a few miles south of UVA. And Potter's turned it into a stunning, open, and airy tasting room that retains that classical architecture. The location also includes a beautiful outside area that hosts concerts and other events. It's a former Episcopal chapel, and also an artist home that's been linked to several famous people, such as 20th century architect Eugene Bradbury, Lady Astor as well, and also the novelist Erskine Caldwell too. Oh, and finally, Henry Pop Lanigan, if there's any UVA sports fans, that was the first head basketball coach for UVA and also the namesake for the field there as well. So lots of famous people resided at Nev Hall, which is now the tasting room for Potter's. Potter's produces one of my favorite non-traditional ciders called the Haven. I have a passion for Belgian beers, and Potter's take on this Trappist-style cider is spot on. The blend is fermented on dark candy syrup, figs, and coriander. A Belgian yeast is also added, and the resulting flavor is fantastic. I highly recommend it. If you're looking for a unique excursion and chance to taste some great ciders, then you need to check out Halcyon Days Cider Company in Natural Bridge. At Halcyon, you can journey through a labyrinth of more than 2,000 apple trees of 50 different varieties. It's a 1.7-mile labyrinth that's modeled after the Chartres Cathedral in France. But what is really unique about the trail is that it traces the history of the apple from Central Asia to America, which is remarkable. In the middle of the labyrinth is a pavilion that provides a stunning 360-degree view of the Allegheny and Blue Ridge mountain ranges. And once you reach the center with your glass of cider in hand, you have achieved the pinnacle of a halcyon day. The owner and cider maker, Larry Kreidemeyer, believes in using the natural characteristics of the cider apple to shine through. And this is evidence in his product called Jubilance, which features Harrison, another very popular heirloom cider apple, which hails from New Jersey. His single varietal creation spent some time in oak and then was bottled and filtered, leaving a bit of residual sugar that balances out some hefty tannins. My first visit to Bold Rock was back in 2012 when my wife and I we made a detour from our typical Virginia wine trip, and we stopped by a new cidery in Nelliesford. The cider maker, Brian Shanks, poured us a few samples in a quaint barn and chatted with us about property owner John Washburn's plans for a much larger Bold Rock tasting and brand experience. Shanks, who is a world-renowned cider connoisseur and also known as the father of cider production in New Zealand, joined forces with Washburn to create a national brand, which they have obviously done. Many of you, when you think of Virginia cider, the probably first thing pops in is Bold Rock because they are very widely distributed. They're second in sales as of 2021. I think the note I have is next to Angry Orchard. So that's a Virginia cidery second in terms of sales. Pretty remarkable. The dynamic duo named their brand Bold Rock after the name of Wintergreen's Black Rock, as well as a tribute to the company's bold mission and style. The Bold Rock brand now includes multiple locations in Virginia and North Carolina. Its Nelliesford location features a beautiful one-of-a-kind tasting destination that includes a lovely restaurant that overlooks the Rockfish River. It's beautiful if you've ever been there. Their facility offers not only ciders, but also hard seltzers and liquor or distilled products as well. They make some great cider cocktails in their restaurant. One that I recommend is their Apple Manhattan, which consists of Bold Rock bourbon, sweet vermouth, apple simple syrup, and of course, Bold Rock cider. Out of all my alcohol travels, Ditchley Cider Works is among the most picturesque that I visited. Ditchley is a stately, elegant manor tucked away in Kilmarnock. Ironically, this is the only cidery in the historic Northern Neck area Yet the plantations in early Virginia along this stretch of fertile land were filled with orchards. This land where the cidery sits was inherited by Hancock Lee in the late 17th century. It had stayed in the Lee family for a while, and then the DuPont family acquired the manor in 1929, where they added on to the historic property. If you fast forward about 85 years, two retired Navy vets, Kathy Grossclogs and her husband, Vice Admiral Paul Grossclogs, bought the property in 2014 with a promise that they would be good stewards of the historic estate. Their purchase consisted of the manor house, the caretaker's house, a beach, and 160 surrounding acres. After a few years of renovations, Ditchley Cider Works opened in 2018 in the former caretaker's house. The renovated house now includes a working farm, incorporating an orchard of more than 50 varieties of cider apples. All their cider comes from trees on their property, and they do everything in-house, growing, picking, crushing, and pressing the apples, as well as bottling. Part of this self-sufficiency involves orchard pest control from the geese and the turkey that eat the bugs. The hogs on the farm are also part of the system. They are fed the leftover apple pomace. So you can imagine the sausage and how wonderful that would taste. They offer a few different types of cider, ranging from a hopped version, an off-dry blush, and also more traditional English styles. Patois is the French word for a regional dialect. This is important to Patrick Collins and Danielle Lecomte, owners of Patois Cider based in Charlottesville, as the regional is what it's all about for them. It's about getting the best products in the area, and Patois doesn't back down from a challenge, as you can see here with Patrick up in the tree. They like using trees that have been untouched, usually on someone's homestead, but it can be difficult and dangerous sometimes. Patrick told me stories of how he climbs up to get the fruit and will sometimes have to fend off wild animals for the bounty that are also in the tree. He's also had to scare off cattle that are below waiting for the apples to fall. Patrick comes from a wine background and embraces a strict natural fermentation process. And their lineup consists of a diverse group of ciders from single varietals, flavorful blends, and also wine co-fermentations. This is something that several cideries also do. Patois does a co-fermentation with Vidal Blanc, a grape that grows very well in Virginia, and also one of the more popular Virginia wines. Their bricolage, which is one of their blends, is one of the most exquisite ciders that I've ever tasted. It's great with food or on its own, and it shows the craft of cider making while utilizing the beautiful bounty of what Virginia apples have to offer. The 2019 version, the bricolage, his blend, the fruit came from Albemarle, Nelson, and Augusta counties. It changes every year, but it is fantastic year in and year out. Patois also has very detailed bottle descriptions on their ciders. This is similar to how Troddenville at Oakley Farm does theirs as well in Bath County. And this really is a result of the cider maker's background in the wine industry. Each cider description goes into detail about the site where the fruit was harvested, the weather, the soil, and also the fermentation process. Tristan Wright, owner of Lost Boy Cider, fell in love with cider on a trip to Ireland, but there was a problem when he returned to the States, as he had a tough time finding a good cider. Fast forward to 2015, and Tristan was diagnosed with a serious soy and gluten allergy, so he set out to find a craft beverage alternative to beer. I've come across many stories like this on my cider journey, as a health alternative. And so he remembered his He remembered his cider experience in Ireland. And since cider is gluten-free, Tristan then learned everything he could about cider making. After 2 years of researching the craft and taking classes at various cider institutes, he left his job in the finance sector and set up his operation in Alexandria in 2019, which you can see on the screen. His urban cidery is located in an open and airy building and features a lovely outdoor space that makes for a perfect spot to get away from the busy Nova traffic and enjoy a glass of cider. They have a wide variety of cider, and they even have this exploratory series, which is very diverse. There are some offerings in their exploratory series that are pickle infused. There's a ginger infused. Ginger is one that I've seen a lot of cideries used. There's also, I'm trying to think, there's a Halloween version, which usually infuses some form of Halloween candy. I came across this when I visited Lost Boy, and there was a carboy, 5-gallon carboy with these little candies in it, and they were Sour Patch Kids fermenting in the cider. So that's a bit interesting. I wasn't there to taste it because it was still fermenting, but so you can check out those unique offerings at Lost Boy. But they also do traditional ciders as well, and single varietals. Their Hughes Crab is fantastic. Their flagship is called the Comeback Kid, which you can see on the screen. And that's really a testament to Tristan's journey as a lost boy and then finding his way at this cidery. As I traveled around the Commonwealth chatting with different cidery owners and cider makers, there was one question I was always asked. Have you chatted with Chuck Shelton at Albemarle Cider Works? Chuck is often referred to as the grandfather of Virginia cider. He has helped numerous cider makers, and his knowledge of the fermentation process are endless. He has consulted with cider makers, managed interns who became future cider makers and cidery owners, like Courtney Maley, founder of Bluebee, and he has provided guidance for the Virginia apple community. His kind personality, dedication to the craft, and willingness to share his expertise has really led to the success of the Old Dominion's cider industry. In addition to the cider, Albemarle also has a nursery called Vintage Virginia Apples. And this combined operation, located just outside of Charlottesville in North Garden, is a true family affair. Chuck's sister, Charlotte Shelton, has worn many hats, including CEO of Vintage Virginia Apples. And one of her main goals for Albemarle is to bring the orchard to the glass in the form of what she refers to as fine cider. And they do this very successfully. Other members of the family include Bill Shelton, who's the nursery manager, and also Bill's daughter, Ann Shelton, who assists with the day-to-day operations. Their artisanal style is rooted in history, and you can see this in their cider portfolio, especially their 1817 cider blend. The amber-colored cider is full of lush tropical flavors that comes from a blend of 3 historic apples: Harrison, Hughes, and Winesap of New Jersey. The recipe is from apple historian William Cox's book, A View of the Cultivation of Fruit Trees and the Management of Orchards and Cider, which was published, you guessed it, in 1817. The great cider expert remarked that the finest liquor I have ever seen was made from Hughes, with a small portion of the Harrison apple of Newark and Winesap of Jersey. This full-bodied beverage was, and it is still, one of the best examples of historic cider. As we conclude our discussion on the Commonwealth's beverage of choice, both past and present, I hope that you have found our time together to be a fruitful experience. And now I encourage you to go out and taste the wonderful world of Virginia cider. Thank you. think we have time for a few questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and Graham will maneuver through the auditorium.
I have a couple of questions about cider, and I guess first of them is it under the control of the ABC board? And secondly, as a toddler growing up in the 1930s, I can remember visiting my grandparents' farm, tobacco farm, just across the Virginia line into Carolina. He had a peach as well as an apple orchard, as well as regular bootlegging, from what I can understand from the revenuers. But there was a building on the farm that Mom always said was a special building of my granddad's, and it was called the Brandy House. Now, is there a lot of difference in fermenting brandy or apple cider as it is other alcoholic beverages?
Yeah, two great questions. So the first one, cider is treated as wine, so it's under the same type of regulations in Virginia. And a lot of people will, we have this discussion on, how do you compare cider to wine and beer? Legally in Virginia, that's how it's treated as cider is treated as wine. The second question is great because in the book I talk about distilling that cider, and of course that would be apple brandy, and that was something that was done on these plantations. It was profitable, it was economic means. It wasn't just for taste, but also to be sold. So that was very evident throughout Virginia. There's some areas, and I know Diane Flint talks about this, some areas and regions, I think especially kind of where you're talking about, that had a very big brandy production. I also talk about Laird's Distillery in the book, and they're the oldest licensed distillery in the nation out of the Northeast, but they have a production center and distillery in Virginia, just outside of Charlottesville. Washington loved the Applejack recipe from Laird's, and they're corresponded back and forth, and they make brandy today. So brandy is definitely a big part of that alcohol, that cider, that apples make, for sure. Yeah. But thanks for sharing. That's interesting.
What are the most successful areas in Virginia for cider growing? I noticed on your map earlier the concentration in Northern Virginia and just a few like in the Northern Neck that you had a slide of. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah. So when the plantations, if we look at the history of Virginia and plantations, mostly on the Northern Neck and that area, and there are orchards all over the place for sure. And once cider starts to kind of, transition, many of those orchards that were there start to transition to more fresh eating apples. And they've been found to grow very well, obviously, in the valley and other areas. So we see that transition. And so the concentration in terms of cideries follows kind of the apple production, similar to wine. So if you follow the wine map of where grapes are grown well today, that's where apples are grown well mostly. But yeah, there's definitely a lack of orchards now in the Northern Neck for sure. And we see most of them in the valley. And I talk a lot about Winchester in the book, the apple capital, the sign apple capital of the world, right? And so look at orchards like Glaze Orchards that ships apples throughout the world. And so huge number are being grown there and distributed. But yeah, those areas where we look at orchards now are mainly around Winchester area. And in Charlottesville. And then we also see some in the West too, but not as much in the Northern end. Yeah.
This might be like a very big question, but I just get the sense within the last 20 to 30 years or so, there's been such an interest in like the resurgence of craft brewing, cider, wine, particularly here in Virginia. And I just wondered if you had a sense of why that is.
We've got Lee here too.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do, and Lee knows a lot about this too, but once the law was changed that, this is for breweries, I know Lee can attest to this, but once the law was changed so that breweries could sell from their location, you could come in and have a pint of beer. That was not always the case, and they would once, I don't know, Hardywood comes in and helps lobby with the legislation in Virginia, and that changes for sure. I think also, so then people use it as a destination more than just going to pick up the beverages to go, right? So I think that has a lot to do with it, the legislation that allows you to, treat it as a bar or a pub to come in and have a drink. Also, I think the success of other states and other regions, Virginia kind of piggybacked on that. So I think those two things are a real reason. I also think people look for those destinations. I know my wife and I love to go out and experience, that orchard to glass, that you can have at many of these cideries. That's one thing about cider. They're in Virginia. We're using the products that are grown here. That's remarkable. A lot of other beverage industries don't necessarily have that super local product, but Virginia cider is for sure. It's about the apples. It's local. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Greg will be up in the lobby shortly. Happy to sign books for you.